For all the tools we use in the garden, I think secateurs are probably the thing that we use the most, and probably the thing that we abuse the most as well. We're about to start our winter pruning here at Gordon Castle, and I thought I'd take you through the steps that we go through to service, clean and sharpen our secateurs. So there are dozens of different types and makes of secateurs, and if you're just doing a bit of cutting back in your garden, to be honest, it doesn't really matter what type you get. But if you're doing some serious pruning, it's well worth investing in a decent pair. In all of the gardens I've ever worked at, we've always used Felcos, and the reason being they're so well made that they really do last a lifetime. You can replace every part of them, you can even send them back to Felco to get serviced, and they're just very high quality, so I think it's well worth investing. If you've got the money, it is well worth investing in a decent pair. Now, we don't always take apart our secateurs, clean them and sharpen them every time we go out pruning. It's quite easy just to sharpen them very quickly with a small sharpening stone like this. This is made by a company called Spyderco, but Felco do a very good one. There are various other ones you can find on the internet and in garden centres. And all we do, probably twice a day, first thing in the morning and once after lunch, is just refresh the edge of the blade. If you look very closely, there's a very fine bevel. What you need to do is make sure you maintain the angle of the bevel to get it really sharp. So we start on the rougher side and just go around in a circular motion, just gently tidying up and sharpening that edge. You can see where you've been because you'll see the metal start to polish away. And just keep on going in a nice circular motion until you can see it shining. Being very careful to keep that angle on the blade and keep it consistent. If you're wobbling around too much, you can end up blunting it rather than sharpening it. The area at the base of the blade tends to be the hardest bit to sharpen, so quite often you'll have to spend more time on that. So you go through that on the coarser side of the stone, flip over the stone and start using the smooth side. It only takes a couple of minutes to do this. Now the really important thing with secateurs, and in fact any sort of blade, is to keep them sharp and sharpen regularly, and it's so much easier to maintain your tools if you do that. If you let them get really blunt, it can take a long time to fix them, and you'll find that if you're using blunt secateurs, you're more likely to either split stems or for them to wick, where you leave a little piece of the bark on when you cut, and then the plant's more likely to get disease or infection. So I'm just working my way along. And you can test with your finger very gently, and you can feel if it grips onto your skin, then it's sharp. So I think that's pretty much done. The final thing you need to do, because secateurs have a bevel on just one side of the blade, you just sharpen from one side. What happens is you push over a little burr of metal from the edge of the blade to the other side. You can normally feel it if you run your fingers along the back of the blade. And you just need to take that off by laying your stone flat on the blade and just giving it a couple of strokes just to take off that little burr. And so that's it. The other thing that's quite important is just to spray down your secateurs after use with a bit of WD-40 or any other light oil, just to force out any moisture and prevent them from rusting for the next day. So that's day-to-day maintenance, that's quite easy to do. I'll go on and I'll show you how to take them apart, clean them and sharpen them properly. Right, so I'm going to show you how we take apart our secateurs, clean them, sharpen the blade and then put them back together again. It's actually a very simple process. All you need is some spanners, maybe a screwdriver, sharpening stone, some disinfectant, a scouring pad and some wire wool. We tend to do this process maybe once or twice a year, or whenever our secateurs are really starting to look filthy, particularly before we start a big pruning project. It only needs to take about 10-20 minutes. So what you do, first of all, take out the spring, that just pulls out. It's well worth putting things on the bench in the same order that you've taken them off, just so you remember how to put it back together again. Then we take apart this locking mechanism. So this system of cogs is basically how you determine how close the blade is to the anvil, and it's quite important to get this right, but we'll go through that when we put it back together again. So you undo this nut here. This is an 8mm nut. It's always best to use proper spanners for this if you can. An adjustable spanner will work, and you can actually use a screwdriver as well, but it's very easy to damage the metal unless you use a spanner. So we'll take that off. It comes out quite easily. Put it down over here. And then we take apart the next part of the locking mechanism. That just unscrews. It shouldn't be too tight. You don't normally need to do these much more than hand tight, so it should come apart quite easily. There's a plate below that then slides off. Okay. And once you pull it apart, it's the two halves in half, and the blade should come right off now. We'll put that down. These are absolutely filthy, these secateurs, so it's well overdue. Then we slide out the nut, put it there, and then the last thing to do is just to take apart the little lever that holds your secateurs closed. I've got to use an adjustable spanner. I don't have a small enough normal spanner. These can be quite tricky to get off. If anything's going to jam, it's normally this bolt. Let's see. There we go. So you take this one out. And put it down here. And actually, if you look very closely, there's a little washer that goes underneath that plate. Quite often you won't notice it because it's stuck to the secateurs, but there you are, little tiny washer. And it's really important not to lose that because it does an important job that I'll tell you about later on. So there we are, that's the secateurs taken apart. Next job is to clean everything off, so I think we'll probably start with the blade. I've just got a bit of fairy liquid and some sterilising fluid in here. You can use any kind of detergent, you could use methylated spirits, any sort of degreaser would be good for this. You can also buy proper horticultural sprays that will kill off basically any kind of virus or bacteria, and if you're worried that you might have bacterial canker or silverleaf or something in your garden, then it's well worth using a proper horticultural disinfectant. So you want to give them a good scrub. If the scouring pad won't get all the rubbish off, use some wire wool, and that tends to be really effective. It's quite important to try and get in all the little nooks and crannies, so it's worth taking your time over this. So I'll go through, clean all of these things, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to sharpen the blade. Right, so that's everything cleaned off. We'll move on to sharpening the blade. Now, what I'm using here is what's called a water stone. There are other types of stones available. You can use an oil stone. The most important thing is that, for a start, it has two different grits. So this one's got 1,000 grit and a 6,000 grit, so the 6,000 grit being the finer. What you'll find is, quite often the sharpening stones you find in hardware shops are just too rough for doing secateurs, so really you do need to get a very fine stone. You can use emery paper, you can also use a leather strop, but for me this is the simplest method of doing it. First thing you do with a water stone is you soak it in water for about 5 minutes or so, let it soak up all that moisture, and then put it on a nice flat surface. Start off with the rougher side, so this is the 1,000 grit, and then just like with the little stone, what you're doing is you're trying to maintain the angle of the bevel, so this little section right along the edge there. I'm going to work towards myself because I think it's easier to do that. So put it flat on the stone and then just lift it up until you can feel the angle lying flat on the stone itself. And then you're drawing it towards yourself. You have to kind of do it in a circular motion, just in one direction, so you're drawing the blade towards you, and you can hear it grinding away. And the way to look at it is to imagine you're just taking a very thin slice off the surface of the stone. So you can keep that bevel exactly at the right angle. Stay consistent. You can see as you go these black marks appearing on the stone, and that's actually a very fine layer of metal that's been taken off this blade. I'll do one away from myself as well so that you can see. So you're just starting at the edge and then twisting it round to follow the contour of the blade. You don't have to push down hard, you can do it quite gently. And I would suggest, depending on how blunt your blade is, you probably need to do maybe 20 or 30 strokes like this. You can see this blade's still quite tarnished, it still looks grubby, but it's just tarnish on the blade. And that's because it's a high carbon steel, which means it's softer and less brittle, allowing you to sharpen it easy, and also so it doesn't chip. It gives it a very fine edge. You don't want stainless steel really on a very fine cutting tool like this. There we go. I can just start to see it glinting, telling me that it's sharpening up. And again, I can test it on my finger. Probably need to keep doing this. So I'm going to give it, I think I'll probably end up giving it about 30 strokes. There we go. Again, paying a lot of attention to the base of the blade, because that's always the bit that's hardest to sharpen. There we are. And then when you're happy with what you've done there, you can flip over the stone and give it that final polish on the fine grit. So here we go. Because it's dried out a little bit, I'm just going to put a little bit of water on the top. Just adds a bit of lubrication to it. There we go. And it's exactly the same process on this side of the blade. And this is what really gives it its super sharp edge to slice through all those branches. There we are. And the rule of thumb is normally however many times you've sharpened it on the coarse side, you have to do it about twice as many times on the fine side. So it can take a little while. Yeah, that's starting to look quite nice. So when you're happy and it feels like it's sharp, what you need to do is to take the burr off. So again, you flip over the blade and you're working on the flat side of the blade. You just push it away from you, just 2 or 3 strokes, it doesn't take very much, and that'll take that little burr off the back of the blade. There we are, that's starting to feel pretty sharp now. So I'll just clean off the water and the sharpening compound. You may well have to spend a lot more time than I have on this. If you've got little nicks in your blade, it's worth spending a lot of time on the coarse grit just to even it all out. There we go. So that's that. And when you're happy and it's sharp enough, it's feeling pretty good, you can start putting them back together. Now the process is very easy, but what we do when we put it back together is we lubricate it at the same time. So I'm just using a bit of grease. Almost any sort of grease will do for this. We're just using the stuff we use on our tractor, but bicycle grease works very well. So you start off putting the blade onto the handle, making sure you get it the right way around. It's slightly counterintuitive, this. So there we go, just sit the blade on there. And then when you look at the anvil, you'll see this little indentation here, and that's a grease reservoir. So what you want to do is just get a little bit of grease. You should probably wear gloves doing this, but there we are. And just fill in that little reservoir. You don't want to use too much, because grease will pick up grit and dirt and end up grinding away at the metal. So just a little bit of grease in there, and that'll keep it continually lubricated. Every time you squeeze your secateurs, a bit of that grease will keep it lubricated and working nice and smoothly. Just put a little bit more in there. So that goes in there. And then I like to put just a little bit on the nuts and bolts so that they don't seize up and it's easier to take them off next time I come to do this process. also prevents water from getting in. So you just slot in the bolt through this side, simply enough, and then slot the secateurs together. It takes a bit of a wiggle. And then next we've got our locking plate. I'm just going to put a bit of grease on the back of that. Not too much, again, just enough to keep any water and moisture out. Both sides, I think. There we go. And then just slot that over there. And then we can take our little cog nut. And again, on the base of this, you'll see there's another grease reservoir, so I'm going to put some more grease in there. There we go. And then slot it over the top. And you don't want to do this up very tight. So screw it up, hand tight. I don't think I'd even use the spanner for this. And what this does is it pushes the blade against the anvil. So you want to have it, so when you look down the blade you can see it just passing the anvil and there's no gap between, but you don't want it so it's pushing too hard and the blade binds up. So I'm not going to use the spanner on that, I think that'll be okay. And then the next step is to lock that in place, going through this little part which just sits in the teeth of the cogs, like that. And that stops it spinning any more when you open and close the secateurs. And then you just slide through the bolt. There we go. In fact, I'm actually going to put a bit of grease on the end of this to make the process easier. Again, these bolts can bind up after a lot of use and lots of plant sap. They can bind up, so I think it's worth greasing them up now and saving some problems later on. There we are. And I'm actually probably going to need a spanner for this. Here's my number 8. It's got a long thread, so it takes a little while to screw this in. And just before you tighten that up, what you really want to do is pop your spring back on and make sure they're working nice and smoothly and not wobbling at all. So let's put this spring back on. Yeah, they're opening up quite happily when I let go. That's really important. There's nothing more annoying than secateurs that stay closed when you let go of them. That seems to work pretty well. And there's no wobble, so if you hold both the handles like this, you'll give them a flex. You shouldn't feel any wobble. It will damage the blade. If you leave them too loose, you'll damage the blade when you come to cut stems. So that feels fine, so I'll give that one last final tighten. There we go. And then the last step is to put on the little clip that holds it closed when you've finished using them. A bit more grease on there. And then the important thing to remember here is this little washer has got to go on underneath the little clip. So it can be a bit fiddly this. The best way to do it is to put the bolt through the clip and the washer and then screw them in. And what's so important about that washer is that it stops the clip from flopping around, and you've probably had it where you're cutting your stems, the clip flops and it locks the secateurs, and it's extremely annoying if it happens several times whilst you're pruning. So that washer is very important. And in this case I need to use the adjustable spanner. And we just want that tight enough so that it's not flopping around, but also so it's easy enough for you to move it with your thumb when you want to keep the secateurs closed. There we go. There we go. And there, it's a nice clean, smooth working pair of secateurs. You can give it a light spray of WD-40 if you're not going to use them straight away. And that's it. So it really is well worth taking care of your tools. They'll last a lot longer that way, providing they don't end up on the compost heap, which a lot of our tools seem to sometimes. But also it means you can prune better and it's better for the plants.